Hello, everyone. How are you today? I am Elizabeth Corey, and I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And we are here today, this Tuesday, noon Eastern, to talk about another trauma topic. Today, specifically, I'm going to be talking about projection. I mean, it may be one of the most commonly used words in all of mainstream psychology, to be honest, but I'm going to get a bit more specific about it, and I'm going to talk about it from a perspective of how that works with inner parts and what it looks like when you bring in the inner parts world and you talk about projection from that perspective. Because personally, I think, and granted, I think this is true with almost everything, I think that projection makes more sense when you talk about it from an inner parts perspective. So that's what I'm going to do. But then again, I think pretty much everything about life makes more sense when we talk about it from an inner parts perspective. So there you go. Probably not surprising coming from me, but that's kind of the focus for today. Let's talk a little bit about projection. So as I said earlier, I just love talking about projection from a standpoint of inner parts. I really think it makes sense. And specifically today, I want to talk about judgment as a projection. Now, I'm not going to talk about like serious judgments when people are making criminal activity or things like that, where people are making huge life-altering mistakes and we judge that. I'm not really going to get into that too much today. I'm going to keep the focus on stuff that we kind of judge as we go throughout our day. So, and I like to do this actually as a part of healing, because sometimes when we're on this healing journey, we can look at things, like we can the steps we take, we can focus too big. Like we can go way out into big picture. And honestly, sometimes when we do that, we get overwhelmed and confused and we get stuck. And if I'm honest, that's sometimes a bit of a defensive strategy too, that we use against ourselves, especially some of our defenders. So today, I want to keep it small. I want to talk about little things that we judge, okay? And I think that talking about this way actually helps us in two ways. It helps us to understand how other people are judging us, but it also helps us to understand why we might be judging others. So we can look at it from both of those lenses. And I know if you guys are following me, you're very good at looking at your own stuff. Like, you're not just going to externalize it and make it everybody else's problem. But the whole point of projection is that that's what we do. So we want to kind of talk about it from all of the angles. We want to consider how it's impacting us as well as considering how it's impacting others, okay? Because both are very important. And I'm going to start off with just a quick overview of the cycle of shaming as it happens within families. So when we talk about breaking the cycle, right? Like everybody talks about that. That's another one of those buzzwords. I'm going to break the cycle. It's going to be different for my kids than it was for me. Wonderful thing to say. We should all be trying to do that. I don't care who we are. We should all be trying to do that to some degree, right? So breaking the cycle. One of the biggest cycles that we experience in families with abuse going back generations or trauma that is still happening. One of the biggest issues we have is sort of this shaming cycle, where generation after generation after generation, we keep shaming ourselves. And the thing about this is, a lot of times there are aspects of our authentic selves which are somewhat hereditary, which means we are born to people who have already shamed themselves out of their most authentic self. And unfortunately, their authentic self look a little bit like your authentic self. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect situation. I'm not saying we are exactly the same authentically as our family, but we will usually have enough in common with them that they already have a lot of experience sitting in their unconscious on how to shame our particular authentic gifts, okay? So what ends up happening, we get born into these families have already learned, the people in these families have already learned how to shame themselves about their authentic gifts. And so they bring on that shame the minute their children, right, us who were born into these families, start to exhibit similar authentic gifts. And so as the cycle continues, we end up taking on the shame of our authentic gifts. We shove all of those authentic gifts down and away into our unconscious. It lives there with inner parts that are also suppressed and now unconscious. And we employ what I call defenders over top of these inner parts that hold our authentic gifts. And these defenders tell us over and over again every day in our unconscious that whatever those things are, they're not good enough. They're not acceptable. They will not be like, they're not worthy. They're not worthwhile in this world. We do not need to live in the world in that way. So we take all of these things and we shove them away, right? And then guess what? The next generation is born and we're like, oh, they're exhibiting the stuff I'm shaming myself for. So guess what we do? We project the same defenses that we're using to suppress ourselves onto them. So the shaming continues, it continues, it continues. This is what we have to break when we talk about breaking the cycle. We have to break that shame cycle of, hey, you're exhibiting this authentic gift. I already know in my unconscious that gift is not acceptable. Therefore, I'm going to tell you it is not acceptable for you to do it either. And it goes on and on and on. And it is by no mistake that our particular gifts that we're born with are the ones that are targeted in these families. And our goal is to begin to bring those things out into the world, of course. There are people out there who have done it, and we've seen people out there who have done it. It's not an easy journey because there's all this internal yuck that stops us in our tracks. But as it happens, we are really breaking that cycle as we stop the self-shaming, and then we can stop the shaming of the next generation. The problem is that most of us here talking today with me, having this conversation at this moment, already have our authentic gifts pretty much shamed and suppressed in our system. We're working to let it out because we can tell something's not right, right? But may not totally be there yet. Some of our inner parts are suppressed in there. The ones that have our gifts, the ones that have the things that we're supposed to bring to the world. Now, when I talk about gifts, I'm talking about the grounded aspect of these suppressed parts, okay? There is an ungrounded side to these suppressed parts, and that ungrounded side is the side we are maybe even more scared of letting out than the actual grounded gift at this point, right? So we have to look at this ungrounded stuff. And what happens is we feel so much shame and so much embarrassment and so much dislike for these parts in our system that are exhibiting ungrounded symptoms of having been suppressed for a long time, that our controller and our karmic kid, our really big defenders in our system, are just they're employing all possible defenses to push all of this down. So what that means is that when we run into somebody in the world out there who maybe exhibits some of these ungrounded or grounded characteristics, our defenders are pretty quick to judge them, all right? Because unfortunately, what often happens is our parts are fueled by what we see in the world. And unfortunately, again, what that means is that if we're surrounded constantly by people who are really strongly enmeshed in their controller or enmeshed in their karma kid, we're going to keep fueling the defenders. However, if we meet people who are maybe exhibiting some signs of what we've suppressed in ourselves, that starts to feel threatening to those defenders, and we start projecting our judgment onto them. Now, guess what? People are doing this to us too. We're going to talk more about that too. But I just wanted to give you some examples of what I mean here. I broke it down into two categories because we have the controller judgment, the projection from the controller, which I'll be honest, is probably going to be a lot of your judgment. Controllers are very judgmental, and they're probably the most key projector in our system, if I must say. So these are going to be big. However, there are other parts that project. And so I also wanted to do a little bit of sort of freedom fighter judgment, explain that a little bit and some examples of what that might look like too, just to give you a sense of what it is I'm talking about on a more practical level. So let's talk about the way that our own controller may judge others who exhibit certain grounded or ungrounded characteristics of other parts in our system. And so the first one I chose here is someone choosing a creative career. Okay. Now, I'll be honest, I think a lot of us were meant to be creative. I think maybe even to some degree, most of us were meant to be creative. We were meant to be creative in a very grounded way. And that creativity is something that really can't come from the mind, right? It's a very intuitive creativity. It's something that exists on a very deep level within us. And so we live in a world, this isn't just in our families, we live in a world that passes a lot of judgment when it comes to people who choose to move in a creative direction. Part of that judgment will come out sounding very logical. There's no money in that, right? Well, why is there no money in that? Because we don't value it. That's the judgment, right? And we may have been hearing this since we were very young. I heard from a very young age, go into business. That's where you make a lot of money. I heard it my whole life. I did go into business. And then found myself at 37 going through an entire career change, right? But I listened, my controller listened to all the other controllers out there. But when we meet somebody who has decided to go in a direction of a creative career, and I don't just mean painting and artwork and in music, creativity can come in a lot of forms, okay? So I want to be really clear about that. But when you meet somebody who chose to go in a creative direction or something that maybe isn't your everyday, maybe they don't work for that corporation that everybody tells us we have to work for. Maybe they're trying to do something on their own. Maybe they're self-employed. Maybe they're choosing to go down a direction of art or music or something. Oftentimes the first thing that comes into our heads is, oh, that's going to fail, or they'll never make any money doing that, or that's too risky, or I can't even believe they're trying that, right? The judgment starts, right? Okay. And this is some of the ways the judgment can sound. This is our controller. And what this can tell us is that deep down inside, we may have some desires to do maybe something similar, maybe not, but the controller within ourselves is suppressing that desire, okay? Now, it doesn't always mean that, but a lot of times it does. So looking at how the judgment is showing up and also how, intense it gets with us. Is it a really intense judgment that shows up the second we meet people? That's more likely to be a projection than if it's not such an intense judgment, right? So that's the first one that I wanted to talk about. So look for that. Another one is someone shows emotions, right? And this is, of course, especially true with little kids, but it's also true with adults. Somebody shows emotions. Many times we will begin hearing from our controller. What's our controller saying? Oh my gosh, can you believe that person's being emotional? They should really hide that. Why are they being so vulnerable? Nobody wants to see that. So in comes the controller. And I'm talking about in our heads, right? Judging those emotions. And believe me, I used to have a controller that judged emotions, and now I get excited every single time somebody expresses an emotion, but that's because within myself, I've stopped suppressing my emotion. For the most part, not entirely, but I sure am working on it all the time. So when we judge emotions, it's because we're judging our own emotions. And if we have certain emotions that we judge more in others, guess what? That's the one we judge in ourselves the most. Okay, so again, judging emotions is a projection. Now, this goes both ways. If you are the kind of person who expresses emotions and you're constantly faced with judgment, guess what? Those people are scared of their own emotions, so they're judging yours, right? How many times do we hear, don't cry, 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 all day long. And then when we were kids, it may have even come with, I'll give you something to cry about, right? We've been hearing our whole lives that our emotions are unacceptable. This is a projection because nobody else wants to be reminded of the emotions they are not feeling within themselves, okay? That is a projection. Okay. Someone Here's the next one. Someone makes decisions based on feeling, emotion, or love, right? So a decision is made, and I do this all the time now. I didn't used to. Basically every decision I made was based on a spreadsheet that had pros and cons. It was very well thought out and highly logical. I do not make decisions like that anymore. Those were the worst decisions of my life. Now I make decisions based on feeling and intuition. That's what I make my decisions based on today. People judge that. And I see them judging it, and it's fine because I know they're not in a place where that feels comfortable to them. That feels probably pretty horrible to them because it's not how we are taught to operate as human beings in this society at this time. So when you see somebody making a decision from something that doesn't seem logical and you hear judgment coming up, that's because your controller doesn't want you to lean in the directions of making intuitive decisions, because that takes away from the controller's control over the system. The mind's running the system when you're making decisions from the mind and from logic only, right? Another one, someone changes their mind a lot. Okay, now this is generally an ungrounded symptom associated with potentially a grounded part or several grounded parts. However, when someone changes their mind a lot, it often is very triggering to the controller. The controller can be an extremely rigid part that lives within us who will hold on to things, clutching, like grabbing hold for dear life, right? Holding on even well after something should have been let go of. So the controller will have a tendency to judge people who maybe let go easier, right? Maybe they have an easier time of seeing when something isn't working for them. That's the grounded side, right? Maybe they change their mind all the time. Maybe they can't settle on something. That can be an ungrounded response to having a lot of parts in our system that we're switching back and forth between. However, on a more grounded level, sometimes we just need to know when to let go of stuff. Now, the controller does not know how to do that. So they stay quite rigid. They hold on to things too long, and that can cause us a whole series of other problems. So when we feel ourselves judging somebody because they let go of things, it's important to look at how that could be a projection for us. Then the next one I want to talk about here is if somebody struggles to be productive because maybe they are dealing with high levels of futility. This can translate to maybe they struggle with depression in some way, shape, or form. Controllers will judge this very, very quickly and heavily. Like there's a lot of judgment that comes from controllers about futility and depression. And that's because controllers are running from that within ourselves. Nobody wants to face their futility. Nobody wants to face that karmic hit emotion inside of us. And so we run all over the place. And when we meet somebody who is not doing that, the controller can feel very threatened by having that mirrored to us. And so the judgment will start to come out. That person needs to do more. That person needs to get out more. That person needs to be more productive. They need to do, right? That is coming from the projection of our own controller who is terrified of our own futility. I work with a lot of clients who, when they first start with me, they're like, I don't think I have that karmic hit. All I do is run. I run nonstop, right? That's their controller denying the very existence of the karmic hit, because they do not want to face the futility in their own system. Unfortunately, without facing that futility, life can be pretty exhausting. Fun, because we're using a lot of energy to push the futility down and away, but also we're using a lot of energy to run ourselves around trying not to look at it. So both of those things are going to create a lot of exhaustion for us when we're not facing the futility in our systems. So, but boy, we can have a lot of judgment for somebody who's struggling with depression or futility, because we know deep down inside it lives within us too. So those are some of the controller judgments I wanted to list out for you today. But I also want to talk about the fact that judgment, the projection judgment we've been talking about today, doesn't just come from the controller. Although a lot of times it does. It also can come from other parts. We have a group of parts I refer to as the freedom fighters. These are, in a sense, the opposite of our defenders. Instead of being focused on safety, they are focused on freedom. They don't really hold fear. I mean, not really. They don't have it. So these parts will also judge, but they will have a tendency to judge people who are significantly controller enmeshed. And you may find, as I've been going through my list, that you weren't really relating to the first group of judgments, but you may find then that you relate quite heavily to these judgments, because what that tells me is you tend to enmesh with your freedom fighters much more than your controller or your defenders in general. So if you're judging from a freedom fighter perspective, you might really struggle with people who are too rigid, okay? People who just cannot change no matter what. Your freedom fighters might come out and just be like, the eyes will roll into the back of the head when you meet somebody who just lives an extremely rigid, scheduled life and can't get out of that place, right? So you may hear judgment in your system when you meet people like that. That is your freedom fighters judging your own controller. And maybe your controller has been a bit more suppressed because, your freedom fighters have just been the stronger set of parts. And so you probably have a controller who would like to live that way, but the freedom fighters will not let that happen. The next one is someone who just doesn't know how to have fun. I mean, it sounds a little similar to the first one, but just someone who cannot really give themselves the opportunity to enjoy life. That tends to be more of a controller or karma kid enmeshment within us that creates that, and the freedom fighters will judge it. The freedom fighters are often furious with the defenders in our systems because those defenders have held us back from living the most authentic and certainly joyful life that we want. Another example, which I talked about a few minutes ago, but this is sort of the opposite, someone who can't let go of anything. So while the controller will judge people that change their mind a lot, people who are enmeshed more with the freedom fighters are going to judge the controller life if they can never let go of anything, right? It's like they've got to, I like to say, you meet those people, they've got to die on every hill, right? They cannot pick a battle. There's just no way they can do it. They just go and go and go and go. And freedom fighters are like rolling their eyes into the back of their head like, what is this person's deal? Just let it go, right? That's what's going on there. There's a judgment of your own controller. And by the way, the reason I'm talking about this is because it gives you the opportunity also to do some writing from these things when they show up for you. And it gives you a sense of which part may be kind of sharing in the moment when you're feeling that judgment coming through. Right? So those are just a few examples. I want to really quickly talk about the solution to this. It's like, okay, so I'm talking about projection. What do we do about it? Like, okay, so I'm judging people. How can I stop that? How can I fix that? What do I do? So one of the biggest solutions we can have for these kind of judgments is learning more how to find compassion for your own suppressed inner parts and the parts that suppress them. So figuring out, okay, how deep down inside am I personally holding parts, suppressing parts within me who want to behave the same way, but that I am judging those parts? How can I take a look at that, right? How can I begin to give compassion to my own tendencies to want to be that way so that then I can find that compassion for others and their choices? I mean, this is the only way really that we're going to fix judgment of others is by fixing judgment of self. Like that's the only way. So the more your compassion grows for yourself, the more your compassion is going to grow for others. And the best way to do that, in my personal opinion, is to journal from the parts who we're judging until you start to hear from the parts that are similar to those other people who caused the judgment within you. That's what we're looking for, right? Like we're looking for that. That is one of the most helpful things we can do. The other thing we can use this knowledge for, as I mentioned earlier, is just to give ourselves a break when other people are judging us, okay? Especially on this journey. we have a tendency to be quite emotional on this journey. We have a tendency to be a little bit less productive. Maybe we're dealing with more of our depression. We're sitting with the karma kid. We're doing those really, really brave, emotional things. We're making decisions that maybe aren't always the most logical decisions or the decisions that the rest of the world would see as a good decision or whatever. We will tend to invite a lot of judgment our way. And this is especially true if we're still in contact with people from our original family of origin, right? So what I really recommend people do is when you're finding yourself faced with a lot of judgment from others, one, take a step back from those people. Spend maybe a little bit less time with them because those judgments are not helpful in our attempts to live a more grounded life, okay? But the other thing is to just keep reminding yourself that these people are judging us because of their own fears of what they don't want to see within themselves. They're judging us because we are exhibiting the very things they are suppressing within themselves. Keep reminding yourself of that, and it will help in your journey, because the truth is there aren't a lot of people who make the kind of choices to become more grounded and more authentic and more who they are. And most of the time we're going to feel quite isolated and quite even attacked, certainly judged by others as we go down this road. Keep reminding yourself those judgments are projections. There really is no exception to this rule, by the way. I'd love to tell you some of the time it's projection. No, it just is. It's projection. Okay. So let yourself understand that as you're on this journey, because it can feel, as I said, really lonely, really isolating. Because people are like, why would you do that? Why would you feel those things? Why would you sit with yourself? Why don't you just get up and do stuff? On and on and on and on all day, right? That's what it sounds like. So keep reminding yourself of this projection concept, especially when you are feeling like the only person in the world who is making a different decision. And I will plan to talk to you guys next Tuesday, noon Eastern. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening. And please just let me know if you ever have any questions about any of these live streams, anything that I'm talking about. Feel free to message me. You can email. The best way to reach me is email, which is Elizabeth with an S at beatingtrauma.com. So please send me your question or anything that you would like to know. I'd love to hear from you, and I will plan to talk to you next Tuesday. Thank you. Bye.